August 9th, 1942. For nearly a year, German forces have strangled Leningrad. As many as 100,000 of the city's residents succumb to starvation every month. But tonight, the date Hitler had once chosen for a lavish banquet to celebrate his conquest of Leningrad, the Soviets get ready to unleash a devastating new weapon that has the capacity to completely change the nature of the siege, something that might just prove more powerful than any bomb. It will be deployed from deep within a strange and completely unexpected building by a group of skeletal figures, some weighing barely 90 pounds. 3 of them didn't survive the preparations. Those who did can barely stand, yet they refuse to surrender. 3,000 artillery shells have just silenced enemy guns to clear the way in a secret operation. Now, the Soviets' weapon is aimed directly at German positions surrounding the city. Inside the building, a lone conductor raises his trembling hand. It's showtime. In the summer of 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, marching over 3 million troops into the Soviet Union and violently breaking the non-aggression pact the two nations had upheld since 1939. The Wehrmacht's Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, had one primary objective: the capture of Leningrad, today St. Petersburg, the USSR's second-largest city, symbolic heart of the Russian Revolution, and a major industrial center responsible for 11% of all Soviet production. Among the 3.1 million people living in Leningrad was 35-year-old Dmitry Shostakovich, already one of the Soviet Union's most famous composers. For Shostakovich, like most of the Soviet population, USSR Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov's announcement of the sudden invasion came as a terrible shock. He would later recall, quote, "On that peaceful summer morning of June 22, 1941, I was on my way to the Leningrad Stadium to see my favorite Sunday soccer game. Molotov's radio address found me hurrying down the street. Our fruitful, constructive existence was rudely shattered. A war, which had so far been fought a long way from the Soviet Union, would now be brought into the heart of the motherland. German forces advanced with terrifying speed, and soon enough, Leningrad found itself under attack. As German artillery began pounding the city and the Luftwaffe rained bombs from above, Shostakovich tried to enlist in the military, but was rejected because of his poor eyesight. Instead, he joined the Leningrad Conservatory's firefighter brigade, appearing in newspapers throughout the country in his firefighting gear. The photograph became iconic, the bespectacled composer in uniform, determined to defend the city of his birth however he could. Yet Shostakovich wanted to do more than just put out fires. He wanted to lift the spirit of his beloved Leningrad and the entire nation by doing what he did best: music. Between air raid sirens and sprints to bomb shelters, Shostakovich worked tirelessly on his most ambitious project to date, his 7th Symphony, which he dedicated to Leningrad itself. But as the situation in the city rapidly deteriorated throughout the summer of 1941, the chances of the piece actually being performed there seemed to be growing slimmer by the minute. By September 8, 1941, German forces had achieved what Hitler had demanded. Leningrad was completely cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union. The last rail connection had been severed when Wehrmacht troops reached the shores of Lake Ladoga. Yet this would be no ordinary siege. Hitler's directive to Army Group North was chilling in its clarity, explaining, quote, "After the defeat of Soviet Russia, there can be no interest in the continued existence of this large urban center. Following the city's encirclement, requests for surrender negotiations will be denied, since the problem of relocating and feeding the population cannot and should not be solved by us." The Führer's plan was not conquest, but annihilation. He intended to starve Leningrad's population, then raise the city and hand the territory north of the Neva River to Germany's Finnish allies. It was a strategy of deliberate genocide. Despite the relentless assaults on Leningrad, Shostakovich had been throwing himself into his work, composing enthusiastically even as the battle raged outside. He recalled, quote, "Neither savage raids, German planes, nor the grim atmosphere of the beleaguered city could hinder the flow. I worked with an inhuman intensity I've never before reached." Indeed, rather than allowing the brutal reality around him to distract or dishearten him, Shostakovich looked upon it as a source of inspiration. While he would later explain that the music was not intended to represent the sounds of war as such, he did say that he, quote, "wanted to convey the context of grim events." Nevertheless, by October, the situation had become unbearable. That month, Shostakovich and his family were evacuated to the relative safety of Kuibyshev, today Samara, where he would continue work on his 7th Symphony. He might no longer have been physically present in Leningrad, but he saw his completion of the piece as part of his patriotic duty. He wanted to send a message of hope to those who had not been as fortunate as himself. Meanwhile, back in Leningrad, as fall turned to winter, the horror began in earnest. Food supplies dwindled rapidly. By November, the official daily bread ration had been reduced to just 125 grams per person, roughly 3 slices, and even this meager portion was often 50 to 60% sawdust and other inedible materials mixed with flour. In the brutal winter of 1941 to 42, up to 100,000 Soviet lives were being lost in Leningrad each month. Scenes of unimaginable horror unfolded as the victims of the war lined the streets. One witness recalled, quote, "They lay there because people dropped them there. Janitors swept them away in the morning like rubbish. Funerals, graves, coffins were long forgotten." As food became increasingly scarce, NKVD reports suggest that many Leningrad citizens had even begun resorting to cannibalism. The city had descended into a hell that defied description, but its spirit still refused to break. By early 1942, Shostakovich's 7th Symphony was finally complete. His original intention had been for the world premiere to be performed in Leningrad by the city's Philharmonic Orchestra, ensuring the people whose courage had inspired the piece would be the first to hear it. However, there was a problem. The Leningrad Philharmonic Orchestra had been evacuated to Novosibirsk. Meanwhile, the city's only remaining symphonic ensemble capable of performing the piece, the Leningrad Radio Orchestra, had given its final performance on December 14, 1941, and had ceased broadcasting entirely on January 1, 1942. As a result, the world premiere of Shostakovich's 7th Symphony would instead take place in the composer's new base of Kuibyshev on March 5th, a performance by the Bolshoi Theater Orchestra, which was broadcast on the radio in various parts of the Soviet Union, and later other countries as well. As the Kuibyshev premiere was followed by one in Moscow on March 29th, in Leningrad, plans were underway to make Shostakovich's dream of a performance in the city a reality. With Leningrad about to enter its 8th month under siege, Andrei Zhdanov, the Communist Party boss defending the city, was keen to resume musical broadcasts to provide what officials called emotional stimulation to the population. Performing the symphony had become, as one observer noted, quote, "a matter of civic, even military pride." The first major difficulty was finding enough musicians. Of the original 40-member Leningrad Radio Orchestra, only 14 or 15 members still lived in the city. The others had either succumbed to starvation or left to fight the enemy. Shostakovich's symphony required an expanded orchestra of 100 musicians, and there simply wasn't anywhere near that number remaining in Leningrad. Posters went up around the city. All musicians were requested to report to the radio committee. Military commanders were ordered to release any soldiers who could play orchestral instruments. The Soviet commander of the Leningrad front, Leonid Govorov, recalled performers from the battlefield and reassigned musicians from military bands. Meanwhile, conductor Karl Eliasberg, himself being treated for dystrophy from starvation, went door to door seeking additional musicians. One of the organizers of the performance remembered, quote, "My God, how thin many of them were. How these people livened up when we started to ferret them out of their dark apartments. We were moved to tears when they brought out their concert clothes, their violins and cellos and flutes." Among those who answered the call was oboist Ksenia Matus. When she took her instrument to be repaired so she could participate in the performance, the starving repairman made an unusual request for payment. She recalled, quote, "I went back to collect it and asked how much I owed. The repairman said, 'Just bring me a pussycat.' He said he preferred their meat to chicken." Eventually, enough musicians were found to make a performance possible. And on April 2nd, Boris Zagorsky and Yasha Babushkin of the Leningrad City Arts Department announced preparations for an unprecedented concert to be held in the city that summer. At first, the ragtag orchestra would have to survive months of rehearsals in the midst of a war zone. As German shells continued to rain down on Leningrad, the first rehearsal took place. The continuing siege meant that Shostakovich's score was still yet to arrive in the city, so Eliasberg had the musicians practice a standard repertoire of pieces by composers like Tchaikovsky and Beethoven, in order to get used to playing with one another. However, while the rehearsal had been intended to last 3 hours, in the end it had to be stopped after just 15 minutes because the musicians were too weak to hold their instruments. Subsequent rehearsals were hardly better. Not only were they often interrupted by air raid sirens, but the performers' deteriorating health made playing complicated. Eliasberg himself had to be dragged to the sessions on a sledge. Musicians frequently collapsed during practice, especially those playing brass instruments. 3 performers even passed away during rehearsals. However, the people of Leningrad were determined to support the musicians any way they could in order to make sure the performance went ahead. Orchestra members were given additional food rations, donated by civilian music enthusiasts, and hot bricks were used to provide warmth in the freezing rehearsal hall. Even so, Eliasberg maintained harsh discipline. Performers who missed rehearsals or arrived late lost their rations, even if they'd been delayed burying family members. Meanwhile, Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony was going international. Keen for his musical message of hope to reach audiences in other Allied countries, the composer arranged for the score to be microfilmed. It was then placed in a protective tin box and smuggled out of the Soviet Union to Tehran, from where it was distributed throughout the West. In June, it premiered in London, and after a fierce competition between conductors Arturo Toscanini and Leopold Stokowski, 2 titans of the classical music world, Toscanini won the honor of conducting the symphony's first U.S. performance in New York City the following month. The concert was broadcast nationwide on the NBC radio network to an estimated 20 million Americans, and released on LP several years later by RCA Victor. The reaction in the West was overwhelmingly positive. They embraced the symphony as the definitive musical statement of resistance against fascism. Time magazine even put a painting of Shostakovich on its cover, looking defiant in his firefighter's uniform against a backdrop of musical notes and the burning Leningrad cityscape, cementing his image as both artist and defender. Yet while the symphony was making waves around the world, the orchestra in Leningrad had still been unable to acquire Shostakovich's score. Finally, in July, it was specially flown in by military aircraft in order to get past the blockade. To prepare individual parts for each musician, despite severe shortages of paper and writing materials. Some musicians were reportedly forced to copy out their own parts by hand from the conductor's score. On August 6th, the orchestra managed to rehearse the entire symphony all the way through for the first and only time. The performance was scheduled for 3 days later. The choice of August 9th for the Leningrad premiere of Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony was a deliberate one. It was the same day Hitler had chosen to offer a banquet at the city's Astoria hotel, celebrating the taking of the city. The Soviets planned to ruin the Nazi victory celebrations with a bold show of resistance. However, Lieutenant General Leonid Govorov, commander of the Leningrad front, understood that if the performance was to succeed, the German artillery positions surrounding the city would have to be silenced. Soviet intelligence had spent weeks locating German batteries and observation posts in preparation for what would be codenamed Operation Squall. The mission was precise: prevent German forces from targeting the Grand Philharmonic Hall, and ensure quiet enough conditions for the music to be heard clearly over the loudspeakers that would broadcast the performance throughout the city. As the afternoon of August 9th approached, Govorov gave the order. 3,000 high-caliber shells were fired at German positions in a massive coordinated bombardment. Meanwhile, Soviet engineers worked feverishly to set up loudspeakers throughout Leningrad. The performance would be broadcast not only to the city's starving population, but deliberately aimed toward enemy lines, a calculated act of psychological warfare described as, quote, a tactical strike against German morale. Govorov also made the exceptional decision to allow Soviet soldiers to listen to the concert via radio, understanding that morale was as crucial as ammunition in the grinding siege warfare. At the same time, preparations were taking place at the venue itself, with guards posted and emergency evacuation plans prepared. Electric lights above the stage, which had remained dark since rehearsals began, were turned on for the first time just before the performance started. By the time evening approached, the bombardment had achieved its objective. German guns fell silent. The acoustic battlefield had been won before the first note was played. Referring to the artillery barrage that had made the concert possible, Govorov would later remark to conductor Eliasberg with military pride, quote, "We played our instruments in the symphony too, you know." At 6 p.m. on August 9th, 1942, conductor Karl Eliasberg's voice crackled across Leningrad's radio waves with a pre-recorded address, quote, "Comrades, a great occurrence in the cultural history of our city is about to take place. In a few minutes, you will hear for the first time the Seventh Symphony of Dmitri Shostakovich, our outstanding fellow citizen. He wrote this great composition in the city during the days when the enemy was insanely trying to enter Leningrad. When the fascist swine were bombing and shelling all Europe, and Europe believed the days of Leningrad were over. But this performance is witness to our spirit, courage, and readiness to fight. Listen, comrades. Inside the Grand Philharmonic Hall, a remarkable scene was unfolding. The audience comprised party leaders, military personnel, and whatever civilians could still make the journey. Among them was 18-year-old Olga Kavada, who had lost both her father and grandfather earlier that year. She later recalled, quote, "The chandeliers were sparkling. It was such a strange feeling. On the one hand, it couldn't be possible. It was just so incredible. The only thing we feared was that the Germans would start bombing us. I was thinking, God, let us listen to it to the end. But then Eliasberg came out, the orchestra stood up, and they played. Everyone was starving, but they were all dressed up in bow ties. Nevertheless, the musicians were layered in multiple coats to prevent starvation-induced shivering. As Eliasberg raised his baton, the hall fell silent. The performance that followed was, by all accounts, far from perfect artistically. But what it lacked in technical precision, it made up for in raw emotional power." Another audience member, Irina Skripacheva, would later describe the effect of the music, saying, quote, "This symphony had a huge impact on us. The rhythm incited a feeling of elevation, flight. At the same time, we could feel the scary rhythm of the German hordes. It was unforgettable and overwhelming." As the symphony progressed, some musicians began to falter due to exhaustion. In response, audience members spontaneously stood up, encouraging them to keep playing. When the final notes faded, the hall erupted. The performance received an hour-long ovation. A young girl emerged from the audience, carrying a bouquet of fresh Leningrad-grown flowers, and presented them to Eliasberg. Oboist Ksenia Matus remembers, quote, "And then suddenly there was a storm of applause. Can you imagine fresh garden flowers during the blockade? It was unbearably joyful." Exactly as planned, the loudspeakers had blasted the music toward enemy positions. The powerful sound of the orchestra playing, despite the siege, had a profound effect on several German troops, many of whom were also tired, hungry, and frightened. One German soldier later recalled how his squadron had, quote, "listened to the symphony of heroes." Others were in tears when they heard the music. Yet another later described the moment of realization that the performance represented for the Germans, saying, quote, "Who are we bombing? We will never be able to take Leningrad because the people here are selfless." The psychological warfare had achieved something beyond what Soviet planners could have imagined. It had demonstrated to the enemy that the human spirit, even under the most brutal conditions, remained unbroken. Eliasberg himself understood the broader significance of what had occurred, concluding, quote, "The whole city had found its humanity. In that moment, we triumphed over the soulless Nazi war machine." However, the impact stretched far beyond those who had been in or around Leningrad that summer night. The performance was broadcast live across the Soviet Union via radio, reaching millions of citizens from Moscow to the far reaches of Siberia. For a population that had endured over a year of devastating warfare, the message was unmistakable. If Leningrad could still produce such beauty amid unimaginable suffering, the Soviet Union itself would survive. Soviet authorities immediately recognized the propaganda value of what had occurred. Within days, newspapers across the USSR were publishing accounts of the performance. Pravda, the Communist Party's official newspaper, declared it a triumph of Soviet culture over fascist barbarism. The story spread to factories, collective farms, and military units, wherever Soviet morale needed bolstering. For Soviet soldiers fighting on other fronts, the performance became a symbol of what they were defending. Reports filtered back from commanders, noting improved morale among troops who had heard radio broadcasts of the concert. The message was clear. This was not just about military victory, but about preserving civilization itself. In the aftermath of its legendary Leningrad premiere, Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony went from strength to strength throughout the free world. During the 1942-43 season alone, American orchestras performed the piece 62 times at concert halls across the United States. However, while the symphony toured triumphantly, the city that had inspired it continued to suffer. The premiere may have marked a turning point in morale, but the siege of Leningrad would continue for another year and a half, lasting a total of 872 days, nearly 2.5 years of systematic starvation and bombardment. By the time Soviet forces finally broke through the German lines on January 27, 1944, an estimated 1.5 million people had perished in Leningrad and its surrounding areas. The performance that had symbolized the city's defiance represented just one night in an ordeal that claimed more lives than any siege in human history. Despite the importance of the symphony in Soviet propaganda during the war, once the conflict was over, it was suppressed by the communist regime. Shostakovich had had a complex relationship with Stalin since 1936, when his opera, Lady Macbeth of the Msensk district, was denounced by the party. Though he had redeemed himself with his Fifth Symphony the following year, Shostakovich had remained wary of Stalin. Indeed, there's much evidence to suggest that his Seventh Symphony had initially been intended as a critique of the communist regime. According to Soviet music critic Lev Lebedinsky, a longtime friend of the composer, Shostakovich had actually conceived much of the symphony before Hitler's invasion began. After the dawn of Glasnost under Mikhail Gorbachev, Lebedinsky revealed, quote, "The famous theme in the first movement, Shostakovich had first as the Stalin theme." Right after the war started, the composer called it the anti-Hitler theme. As Shostakovich had privately confided to Flora Litvinova during the war, the symphony was, quote, "not only about fascism, but about our country, and generally about all tyranny and totalitarianism." This seems to be a carefully coded reference that took on new meaning in hindsight. The hidden critique may explain why Stalin's cultural ministry moved to silence Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, and the composer himself, once the war had ended. In 1948, he was once again denounced as part of a campaign attacking music perceived to have too many Western influences, or which was not considered to be music for the masses. Along with other composers, he was forced to make a public apology in front of the Central Committee. He was dismissed from the Leningrad Conservatory, his family's privileges were withdrawn, and most of his works were banned. After Stalin's passing in 1953, Shostakovich's artistic reputation was restored, and so was the legacy of his Seventh Symphony and its iconic Leningrad premiere. In 1964, a reunion concert was held, attended by Shostakovich himself, in which 22 of the original musicians performed alongside empty chairs to represent those who were no longer alive. While Shostakovich himself passed away in 1975, 14 of the Leningrad musicians performed a second reunion concert in 1992. Today, Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony and the incredible courage and determination required to bring about its Leningrad premiere represents much more than just a musical performance. They show the power of art to triumph over the most brutal circumstances, proving that even in humanity's darkest hour, beauty and culture can serve as weapons of resistance and hope.